She stood in the rain as though it had been sent for her specifically, as though the sky itself had joined the household in believing she deserved no shelter. She braced, as she always braced, for another voice telling her what she was. Widow, whisper, woman who had put a duke in the ground before his 40th year. Instead, a young man crossed the wet lawn without a word, laid his own coat upon the garden wall beside her, and walked back into the dark house as though he had done nothing at all. It was the first kindness offered to her in 11 months that asked nothing in return. She would spend the rest of the winter trying to understand why that frightened her more than cruelty ever had. But that is the end of a thread, and threads, like debts, are best understood from where they begin. The estate had been dying slowly for longer than anyone still living cared to admit, not in the dramatic fashion of fire or ruin, but in the slow Protestant way English fortunes die, a wing shut up here, a footman not replaced there, silver counted twice a year instead of once, because someone, eventually, would have to explain the gaps. The house sat gray and enormous at the end of a mile of chestnut trees, its windows fogged with the particular damp of October, its chimneys smoking reluctantly, as though even the fires resented the cost of themselves. Marriages among such families were never made in heaven. They were made in solicitors' offices, over ledgers, with the same cold arithmetic used to price a herd of sheep or a parcel of bad land. Into this arithmetic, on a Tuesday made of drizzle and reluctant daylight, walked a young man with a satchel of Latin primers and elbows mended twice over by his own uninstructed hand. He was 23, tall in the way of men who have not eaten quite enough to fill the height God gave them, with the kind of tired, watchful eyes that come from a childhood spent doing sums no child should have to do. How far a shilling stretches, how long a coat lasts before the cold gets through it anyway. He had been engaged to teach the 2 orphaned nephews their conjugations, nothing more. He did not want the position for love of scholarship. He wanted it because the alternative was starvation dressed up as pride. And pride, he had learned early, does not keep a man warm. The steward met him at the servants' door with the particular thin smile of a man who enjoys being the one who explains the rules. "One condition," the steward said, not offering his hand. "You will not speak to the Duchess, you will not look at her over long, and you will never, under any circumstance, find yourself alone with her." He asked why. The steward's smile did not move. "Because," he said, "she is the reason the last duke is dead." He did not ask what that meant. A man too hungry to be curious is a man who has already decided which battles he can afford, and this was not one of them. He nodded, took his box of primers and his one good waistcoat, and let the steward lead him through corridors that smelled of tallow and old rain. Weeks later, though the story does not yet know it is weeks later, only that it will be, soon, and violently, that same corridor would be lined with candles and cruelty, and he would stand in it holding a ledger like a man holding a knife he had never meant to draw. Marriages among the nobility are not the only transactions negotiated in cold rooms. Reputations are bartered there too, and a woman's silence is often mistaken for her guilt. But that was later. First there was the house itself, which received him the way a debt-ridden estate always receives new blood, with grandeur gone slightly to rot, like a gown worn too many seasons past its fashion. Ivy had taken one whole wing for itself. The windows on the east side had been shuttered since the funeral, the steward told him, as though shutters could keep grief from finding the rest of the rooms too. He was given a schoolroom with a fireplace that smoked more than it warmed, and 2 nephews, 7 and 9, who regarded him with the flat suspicion of boys who had already lost too much to trust the arrival of anything new, tutors included. The elder one asked, on the first afternoon, whether it was true the Duchess had poisoned his uncle's tea. Samuel said no. The boy did not look convinced, and Samuel understood, with the particular clarity of the newly employed and newly warned, that the household had already tried this woman and found her guilty, and that no evidence had been required for the verdict. He caught his first sight of her 3 days in, a shape at the far end of the long gallery, dressed in mourning gray gone almost to ash, moving like someone who had learned to take up less room than her body required. He remembered the steward's condition. He looked away before she could catch him looking, though something in him, some old, stubborn, unteachable instinct, noted that she did not walk like a murderess. She walked like a woman counting her own footsteps to keep from counting something worse. A house can be taught to hate someone the way a child is taught Latin, through repetition, not through proof. He did not think of her again that day, or told himself he didn't, which was its own kind of lie. He had rules to keep and boys to teach, and a coat with elbows that would not mend themselves a third time. But that night, lying in the narrow tutor's room above the stables, he heard, faintly, through 2 floors and a corridor, the sound of someone moving in the dark, slow, deliberate, awake long after a house like this had any business being awake. He did not sleep. He lay counting the sound the way a man counts coins he does not have, and by morning had convinced himself it was nothing, a housemaid, a loose shutter, the ordinary groaning of an old house settling into its own debts. Weeks later, in the drawing room, with the magistrate's pen already wet with ink, he would remember that sound and understand it for what it was. But that comes later. Everything in this house came later, or too late, or not at all. The first morning of lessons, the boys arrived in the schoolroom smelling of cold porridge and worse tempers, the elder scowling as though Latin were a personal insult, the younger, 6, round-faced, unlucky enough to still believe adults told the truth, asking whether it was true his aunt had poisoned his uncle's tea. "Where did you hear that?" the tutor asked, keeping his voice as flat as a ledger line. "Everyone says it." "Everyone," he said, "is a poor source. I would not accept it in an essay. I will not accept it in my schoolroom." The boy considered this with the seriousness only children give to things adults have stopped taking seriously, then nodded, satisfied, and returned to his conjugations. The elder said nothing, but something in his shoulders eased half an inch, the way a door eases when a draft finally stops finding its way through. Small mercies are the only currency children trust, because they have not yet learned that adults keep ledgers too. That afternoon the steward found him in the corridor and reminded him, again unbidden, of the household's rule regarding the Duchess, as though the tutor had not heard him the first time, as though repetition might succeed where reason had already failed. The steward had soft hands and a harder mouth, the look of a man who had learned early that deference could be worn like a coat and removed just as easily once no one important was watching. "She is not to be indulged," the steward said, "not by the staff. Not by you." "I teach Latin," the tutor said. "I am not aware that grammar requires her indulgence." The steward's eyes narrowed, filing the answer away for later use, the way men like him filed everything, not for justice, but for leverage. Present. Weeks on, in that same corridor, the tutor would stand with a ledger page in his coat, and the steward's face going the color of old tallow, and he would think of this exact exchange and understand, too late to matter, that he had been marked from the very first week. But that night, the second night, he heard the sound again, closer this time, or perhaps he had simply learned to listen for it, and lying in the dark above the stables, tired and stubborn and already, though he would not have admitted it, a little less certain of the household's rule than a man in his position ought to be, he found himself wondering not what she had done, but what exactly kept a woman pacing a cold house at an hour when even guilt should have gone to sleep. Present. The ledger page would be thin as onion skin, and he would hold it the way a man holds a thing he is afraid to crease, because creasing it would feel like doubting it, and he had stopped doubting weeks before he had proof. But that was later. That was the drawing room, and the fire too high, and every face turned toward the door. Past. The third night he did not hear her. The fourth he did, and lay still, and told himself sleep was a duty he owed his employer, that a tutor who yawned through declensions was worth less than his already meager keep. It did not work. He rose, dressed in the dark by feel, the coat first, always the coat, mended twice at the elbow by his own clumsy needle, and went down through the stable's cold breath and across the yard where the gravel had gone soft with rain that had not yet started falling but promised to by morning. Marriages among the nobility are negotiated, not felt. He had heard a curate say this once, at a wedding breakfast where the bride ate nothing and the groom drank everything, and he had thought it cynical. He no longer thought it cynical. He thought it merely accurate, the way a man thinks a debt is accurate. He did not yet know how accurate it would prove for him. The kitchen garden was empty. He told himself he was relieved. Present. The steward would say, in the drawing room, with the guardian's cold eye on him, "He has no standing to speak of household matters," and the tutor would say, "I have a ledger," and something in the room would go very quiet, the particular quiet of people recalculating what they had assumed was settled. Past. He turned to go back, and heard it then, not weeping exactly, something worse, something too controlled to be called weeping, more like a woman counting under her breath and losing the number each time. He stopped at the low garden wall. Beyond it, in the gap between the yew hedge and the glass house, a shape stood very straight in the dark, which struck him as strange. Grief, in his limited experience, bent people, it did not straighten them. This was a woman holding herself upright the way a broken chair is held upright by will alone. He did not call out. The rule sat in him like a swallowed stone. But rules, he was beginning to understand, were written by men who had never stood outside on a wet night listening to someone count. He went back to the stables without a word, without a look, exactly as instructed. He told himself that was obedience. It did not feel like obedience. It felt like the first lie he had told since arriving, and he lay awake a long time turning it over, wondering why a woman accused of driving her husband to the grave would stand in a garden at midnight doing sums. 3 nights later the bricks began. He did not decide to bring them. That was the strange mercy of it. His hands decided before his conscience could object, wrapping the warmed stones from the schoolroom hearth in flannel meant for the boys' chilblains, carrying them down the servants' stair like contraband. He left them on the stone bench outside her sitting room, where the housekeeper would assume the footman had erred, where no one would think to ask a Latin tutor why his palms smelled of ash. He told himself it was charity owed to any creature left cold in a house, with 40 fires lit for men who did not need them. He did not go back to see if she took them. The steward found out anyway. Stewards always did. It was perhaps the one talent the position required. "You were told," he said, in the tone of a man reading scripture he did not believe, "that the Duchess is not your concern. The bricks were mine to give. Nothing in this house is yours to give. You are paid for Latin, not charity." He set down the ledger he was never without, its leather spine soft with handling. Do you know what they called her, in London, before the funeral was cold? No, better that you don't. A pause, calculated as a held note. A woman who counts her husband's last breaths as a debt collected is not a woman you warm bricks for, Mr. Croft. It was the first time anyone had used the word debt about her, and it snagged in him the way a loose thread snags a finger, small but impossible to leave alone. That was the present. The past kept intruding on it, uninvited, the way cold air finds a gap under a door. He kept returning, in the privacy of his own skull, to the shape of her in the garden, straight-backed, murmuring numbers into the dark, like a woman praying to arithmetic instead of God. Grief did not usually keep books. Grief did not stand so still. He had tutored enough grieving boys to know sorrow slouched. Sorrow forgot itself. It did not hold a spine like a ruler laid flat. He began, without naming it to himself, to watch the account books left open in the estate office when he passed to fetch chalk, the columns of sold silver, the dates inked in the steward's careful hand. He did not yet know why he watched. He only knew that a woman who counted under her breath in the rain had likely been counting something specific, and that a household so quick to forbid him her company was, perhaps, more afraid of what she might say than of what she might do. The rule had told him to look away. Instinct, quieter and far less obedient, told him to keep his eyes exactly where they were. Now, in the present, 3 weeks after the rain, though he had stopped counting in days and started counting in kindnesses instead, the steward found him in the estate office with the ledger open and his finger resting on a column that did not belong to him. "You've a schoolroom to keep, Mr. Croft. I've chalk to fetch," he said. "The boys have run through what I had." The steward's smile did not reach the eyes that measured him. It was the smile of a man accustomed to counting rooms before he entered them, tallying who might see and who might tell. "Chalk's in the cupboard by the stairs, not in my ledgers. I wasn't aware ledgers required a lock to be read, only to be altered." A silence dropped between them, thin as ice on a horse trough, the kind that looked solid and was not. The steward closed the book with a sound like a door shutting on a room no one was meant to enter again. "You're new here," he said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if he had been cruel. New men ask questions because they haven't yet learned which answers cost them their position. "I've little enough position to lose." Everyone has something to lose. You'd be surprised how small a thing it takes. He left without the chalk. He did not need it. He had wanted only to see whether the man would flinch, and the man had not flinched, had instead delivered a warning so smooth it might have been mistaken for advice, if advice ever came wrapped so tightly around a threat. That night he copied 3 pages by candle stub, in a hand he disguised by writing slower than his own, the letters leaning the wrong way like a man walking into wind. He told himself it was scholarship, a tutor's habit, transcription for its own sake, and did not examine why scholarship required him to wait until the house was asleep, or why his pulse behaved like a man's who has stolen something rather than merely read it. Aphorism, unbidden, arrived the way they always did in that house, seeping up through the floorboards along with the damp. A great house keeps its secrets the way it keeps its silver, polished, catalogued, and never once counted by the person who owns it. He thought of her again, upright in the rain, murmuring sums into the wet dark, as though numbers might hold a shape sorrow could not. He understood, now dimly, what shape that was. He understood, too, that understanding was a debt, and debts in that house were paid in more than coin. He blew out the candle and did not sleep, listening instead for footsteps that did not come, and for the particular silence of a woman who had learned, long before he arrived, to count everything and trust no one with the sum. Morning arrived the way it always did in that house, grudging, gray, unhurried by anyone's hope. He came down to the schoolroom to find the fire already lit, though he had not lit it, and the elder boy watching him with the particular suspicion of a child who has learned that kindness in that house was usually a prelude to a bill. "The steward came before you woke," the boy said. "He was in the linen room. He didn't know I saw." Later, years later, though he did not yet know to call it that, he would understand this as the moment the thread began to pull taut. At the time it was only a boy's idle report, delivered between conjugations, and he answered it the way tutors answer everything inconvenient, by assigning more Latin. But he filed it. That was the trouble with a mind trained to catalog. It would not stop cataloging simply because the catalog grew dangerous. A house full of secrets teaches everyone in it to become an accountant, whether or not they ever wish to count. He found the steward in the corridor an hour later, keys at his belt like a jailer's, smile arranged with the practiced warmth of a man who has learned that warmth disarms suspicion faster than silence does. "You look unrested, Mr. Croft." The boys keep late hours over their verbs. "Boys," the steward agreed, "will do that." His eyes moved, briefly, to the tutor's ink-stained cuff, the one he had worn to bed the night before, copying, and forgotten to change. "You've taken up letters of your own, I hear. Correspondence?" "Notes, for the lessons." "Of course." The smile did not move. A man in your position can't be too careful what he's seen writing. Or reading. A pause, weighted like a stone, dropped to test a well. Her Grace keeps odd company with paper herself, I'm told. Sums, mostly. A woman alone finds strange comforts. He said nothing. Silence, he had learned in that house, was the only currency that did not accrue interest against you. The steward moved on, keys chiming faintly, a man who had delivered his warning and required no answer to know it had landed. That night, he did not go to the study. He told himself it was prudence. He sat instead by the schoolroom fire with the boys' primers unopened on his knee, listening to the house settle around him, the particular groan of old timber, the wind finding every gap in mortar the way debt finds every gap in a fortune, and thought of the ledger pages folded now inside his coat, against his ribs, where a man might keep something he was not yet willing to call evidence. Suspicion, like frost, does not announce itself. It simply appears one morning on the window, and by then it has already been forming in the dark for hours. Below, faintly, he heard a door, then footsteps, hers, unmistakable now, light and even and unhurried, crossing toward the kitchen garden, toward the wall, toward the rain that had not yet started but would. He rose, coat already in his hand, before he had decided to move at all. He found her exactly where he had known she would be, though knowing did not make the sight of her less arresting. She stood at the wall with her back to the house, a shawl clutched too thin for October, and in her hand, he saw it before she could hide it, a stub of candle guttering behind a cupped palm, and a scrap of paper gone soft with handling. Later, in the drawing room, this same posture would be called guilt. Tonight, it was only arithmetic. He did not speak. He had learned, by now, that speech was the one currency she could not accept from him without cost. A word overheard, a word repeated, a word twisted by morning into something that would cost her more than his silence ever could. He laid the coat along the wall's cold stone, the way a man leaves bread on a sill for something too wary to be fed by hand, and turned to go. "You are keeping a record," she said. He stopped. It was the first time in 3 weeks she had spoken first. I am, he said, because there was no version of a lie that would survive the folded pages against his ribs. Of what? Of what leaves this house, he said. And when? The candle trembled, not from wind, there was none yet, but from something steadier and worse. Then you have seen it too. He had. 2 silver candlesticks in April, a set of fish forks in July, a christening cup that had belonged, the housekeeper once let slip, to the old Duke's mother. Each loss folded quietly into the steward's ledgers under words like repair, melted for reuse. Each entry dated after her arrival, as though the house's rot had waited politely for a woman to blame before it began. They will say I sold it, she said. Not a question. A woman reading her own obituary before it was written. They will say many things, he said. Saying is cheap, proving is not. A reputation, once mortgaged, accrues interest whether or not the debtor did the borrowing. She looked at him then, properly, for the first time since the rain the month before, the coat still folded between them like a boundary neither had agreed to cross. Why do this? She said. The bricks by my chair, the fire lit early. The coat you cannot spare. Her voice did not accuse. It only counted, the way she had been counting silver spoons and vanished cups for months, with no one to tell. He thought of the steward's warning, the keys chiming, the word prudence. He had used to himself an hour ago, like a man reciting a prayer he no longer believed. Because no one else is, he said. It was not an answer that satisfied either of them. But she picked up the coat and did not put it on, and instead folded it once more against her chest, like something she meant to return. And above them, past the black shapes of the hedge, the first rain of the night began, precisely as it had before, precisely as it would again before this was finished. The steward's ledger sat 3 drawers away from where he slept, and he had learned its geography the way a soldier learns the terrain he means to cross under fire. Not boldly, but by inches, by nights. Now, the candle in the schoolroom had burned to a stub, and still he copied. Column after column, the same hand, the same careless flourish on the figure 8, the same small mercies of arithmetic that a dishonest man performs when he believes no one will ever check his sums twice. He copied, not because he understood yet what the numbers meant, but because a man who has been poor his whole life learns to recognize the shape of theft even before he can name it, the way a starving man recognizes the smell of bread through a wall. Then, she had not put the coat on. That detail would return to him later, in the drawing room, in front of witnesses, as proof of something he could not have argued in a courtroom but knew in his chest like a bruise, that she had wanted the warmth and refused it in the same breath, because refusal was the only currency she had left that no one could take from her. Marriages are contracts. Grief is not. And a woman taught to distrust every kindness will test the ones that matter most by declining them first. He heard the boys before he saw them, the younger ones cough, wet and stubborn, through the nursery wall, and the elder one's voice pitched low, trying to be a man about it. He went to them instead of to his bed, because a Latin tutor's contract said nothing about fevers, and he had stopped consulting the contract weeks ago. Now, again, the steward's footstep in the corridor outside made him blow out the candle before instinct had finished deciding why. He sat in the dark with the copied pages warm under his hand, and thought of the word prudence again, and how thoroughly he had failed to practice it since October. Then, In the boys' room, by firelight, he had pressed a cool cloth to a small forehead and told them, in his terrible half-remembered Latin, that fever was only the body arguing with itself, and would lose. The elder boy had laughed despite himself. It was the first sound of unguarded happiness he had heard in that house since his arrival, and he had carried it back to his own room like a coin he meant to spend carefully, on no one, for as long as he could make it last. The footsteps outside his door did not stop. They paused instead, long enough that he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has just done something irreversible, that he had already been seen. The pause stretched long enough to become its own kind of sentence. He did not move. He had learned, in the army of small humiliations that made up this house, that stillness was sometimes the only weapon a poor man was permitted to carry. Then the footsteps resumed, unhurried, and faded down the corridor toward the servants' stair, and he understood that whatever had been seen would keep until morning, the way all the worst things in that house were kept, filed, dated, waiting to be used. A secret in a great house is never destroyed. It is only banked, like coal, for a colder day. He did not sleep. He lay with the ledger pages beneath his pillow, absurdly, as though linen could guard paper better than a locked drawer, and listened to the rain resume its old argument with the window panes. By the time gray light came, he had rehearsed, and discarded, 4 different explanations for why a tutor might be awake at that hour with candle wax on his knuckles, and settled at last on the only one likely to survive contact with the steward's eyes, the truth, reduced to its plainest shape, offered to no one until it was needed. He went down to the schoolroom early, before the boys, and found the fire already lit, not by the maid, whose habits he knew by now the way one learns the habits of weather, but earlier, hurriedly, as though someone had wanted the room warm before anyone could ask who had warmed it. He looked at the neat stack of kindling left beside the grate, arranged with a precision no servant in that house troubled to use, and felt something in his chest tighten that was not fear. Kindness, in a house built on suspicion, becomes its own form of evidence. At breakfast, the steward did not look at him, which was somehow worse than if he had. He passed the toast rack with the exaggerated courtesy of a man saving his cruelty for a more useful hour, and asked, mildly, whether the tutor had slept well, whether the boys' fevers had broken, whether he had found the household's account books as tidy as he'd expected when he'd gone looking for a spare candle in the study 2 nights past. The room did not move. The tutor set down his cup with a steadiness he did not feel, and said that he had found everything exactly where it ought to be. It was, he would think later, the first lie he had told in that house, and the first time he understood, watching the steward's mouth curl at the edges, that lies in that house were currency too, and he had just spent one he could not easily get back. The steward's smile did not fade so much as fold itself away, like a man putting a knife back in his sleeve for later use. He said nothing more of candles or study doors. He asked instead, after the elder boy's Latin, whether the conjugations were coming along, whether the tutor found the schoolroom fire adequate now that October had turned to a colder argument with November, and the ordinariness of the question was its own small violence, because both men understood that nothing asked in that house was ever only the thing it appeared to be. A household in decline learns to speak in 2 languages at once, the one spoken aloud and the one meant. That night he went back to the ledgers, not because he believed himself safe, but because he had already spent 1 lie and knew he could not afford to owe the truth as well. He worked by a single candle stub pinched from the schoolroom, copying figures into the back pages of a Latin grammar where no one would think to look, sales of plate to a Bristol merchant, dated a full 3 years before the Duchess had ever set foot past the gatehouse. Entries in a hand he now recognized as the steward's own, disguised badly as the old Duke's shaking scrawl. His fingers ached with cold and with the particular fatigue of a man doing sums against a clock he could not see. He thought, as he wrote, of the coat on the garden wall, of the woman who had not thanked him for it and had not needed to. He understood now, slowly, the way understanding comes to men too tired to hurry it, that she had not been standing in that rain merely to grieve. She had been counting something, watching something, waiting, with the terrible patience of a person who has nothing left to spend but time, for a mistake someone else would eventually make loudly enough to hear. The desperate do not weep only from sorrow. Sometimes they weep because grief is the only performance no one will interrupt to search their pockets. In the present tense of the house, the steward began, gently, to test his footing, a missing candlestick mentioned at supper, a question about who last held the key to the plate room, dropped into conversation like a stone into still water, watched for ripples. The tutor answered each question with the flat, dull correctness of a man who has decided that dullness is armor. But he felt, under his own ribs, the same tightening he had felt at the sight of the warmed bricks by the schoolroom grate, the sense of two people building something in the dark, without agreement, without permission, each laying a small stone on the same unspoken wall. He did not yet know how soon he would have to stand behind it. The wall came sooner than either of them expected. It came in the drawing room, with the fire too high and the guardian magistrate seated as though the chair itself were a verdict, and the steward's voice pitched to the exact register of a man who has rehearsed his grief. He spoke of missing silver. He spoke of a widow with debts no one could account for. He did not look at her while he spoke, which the tutor understood, by then, to be the truest sign of a lie. He had not planned to speak. He had planned, for weeks, only to copy, quietly, at night, by the stub of a candle he did not report as spent, the ledger pages the steward kept locked and thought unread. He stepped forward now and laid them on the table, the way a man lays down the last thing he owns. A ledger cannot flatter, and it cannot lie for love of anyone. That is why the guilty fear it more than they fear the truth spoken aloud. The dates went back 3 years before her marriage. The guardian read them twice. The steward's face did the slow, terrible collapsing of a man watching his own rehearsal fail. He was dismissed before supper. No one wept for him, which was its own quiet verdict. Afterward, in the emptied room, she did not thank him. Gratitude, she had learned, was a coin that impoverished the giver as much as the receiver. She said instead, plainly, that she had nothing left to offer a man who had given her firelight and bricks and a coat laid on a wall without asking why she wept. Nothing but the guardianship of 2 boys who needed a tutor with standing, not wages. Nothing but a name that came with more debt than dignity. He accepted before she finished the sentence. Marriages among the desperate are not less honest for being unromantic. Sometimes they are the only kind spoken without a single lie in them. That October night returned to him often afterward, not as memory, but as ledger, the first entry in an account only the 2 of them would ever read. He understood now what he had not understood then, that she had not stood in the rain to grieve, but to watch, to count, to wait with a patience that had nothing left to spend but itself. He had thought he was comforting a broken woman. He had, without knowing it, laid his coat beside a woman doing sums by moonlight, trying to catch a thief with nothing but memory and candle stubs. He never told her he had guessed it. He only kept lighting the schoolroom fire early, and she only kept leaving him tea gone lukewarm from waiting, and between them, unspoken, the wall went on rising, stone by ordinary stone, into something that, from a distance, looked almost like